Yes. Yeah. Today, thank you so much for your presence. I know what it means to be on Zoom at this time of the day. And also I had a meeting from actually like small workshop from 5 to 6:30, and then I didn't even wanna go. I mean, so I fully understand your devotion and commitment and sacrifice. So I know that God is so happy with us because we express our desire as Juan gave us word of prayer, like we are desiring to know more about God, and then we are desiring to have the Word of God in our life, embody it, embrace it, even at this moment of time. So, thank you so much. And today we'd like to focus on Genesis 12, verses 1 through 4. So, I open up the passage and let me share the screen. Our few, we can read this passage together. So, Jenny, I see you unmute yourself. So, can I ask you to read this passage?
Okay. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham went as the Lord has told him.
Okay. So let me stop sharing the screen, and then post this passage in the chat box for our conversation. So here is the passage. This is not a new passage. So I just want to gather our initial impression or reaction, any thoughts about this passage. So when you read this passage, what do you think about? This is the moment God calls Abram to be a father of a nation and to give blessing to other nations, making him his father of a great nation in faith. And then in the New Testament, we recognize Abraham as a father of faith. We can relate ourselves with Abraham. Any thought to share? Any reaction, impression, memory?
Well, I think this is an important passage because Abram had faith in God. Because if you think about it, God had told Abram to leave everything behind and go to someplace completely new. But you know, Abram did that, but in return, what God had told him was that, he will bless Abram, he'll bless his name and everyone that follows him, but he also said that whoever don't follow him, he will also curse.
Mm.
So to me, it took a lot of courage for Abram to do so, but I think he also had words of encouragement from God to also do it as well.
Mm. Thank you so much. This is such a great important aspect. God's called to leave from your household, from your land. So sever your ties, like kinship ties, to have commitment to God and before God. Any other thoughts?
When I read this, I have a lot of questions, and I think that there's not enough detail. God says, go from your country, your people, and your household to the land I will show you. But so my question is, where is that? How far away is that? how long will it take me to get there? Who am I going to be with when I get there? Are the people going to be nice? Are the people going to be friendly? There's all these questions that just, I think, seem to rise up when you read all these, which God never answers. It's just get up, go, and Abraham says yes, which I find amazing.
That's important part. I mean, as a person with brain, like we can think and we can reason, right? And then whenever we have communication with God, it is very natural reaction. We ask God some questions, but we don't know like what questions Abraham asked based on this context. Hisan, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I understand this passage about the blessings and promises that God has for Abraham. But one thing that puzzled me, like questioned me, was he said, I will make your name great. It's like, I thought he has made God's name great, but he promised him, okay, your name will be great. So I thought it was very interesting.
Great observation. Actually, part of today's Bible study, I would like to talk about that too. Yeah, I think those are
Got one
wonderful
point.
like points. Yeah, those are wonderful points.
I got
God's
a
call
point.
to leave. God's call to leave, and then there is no such explanation or detail, and then why, like Abraham get to make his name great. It's great. So, yeah, we can begin with those observations. So first of all, I'd like to give you some more context where this blessing occurs and happens. So I just taught Genesis at seminary here. So I think this is very similar topic and contents that I'm giving you. So understanding where God's blessing occurs help us recognize the blessing as the beginning of history. First of all, you all remember creation account, right? After God created human, God blessed, right? God blessed humanity to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the world, right? So Genesis consists of two histories, one primeval history. To paraphrase, this is about the beginnings of humanity and the world, kind of universal history. And the other is particular history that is about God's chosen people, so community of faith. And the both histories begin with an account where God blesses humanity, where God blesses Abraham before his like his his new name, before getting his new name, so Abraham. So based on this, we learn that Bible asks us and teaches us to recognize and confess and profess the beginning of our life as God's blessing. Does that make sense? The Bible teaches us to recognize the beginning of our life journey, like faith journey, as God's blessing. So initial question or reaction to this insight that I have or gleaned together, I think we can ask this question. How do you recall the beginning of your own or family's faith journey? In what ways has it been marked by God's blessing? To give you some other perspective, becoming a great nation, which is a promise to Abram, right? Based on God's blessing, it begins in Abraham's household. So if we embrace this promise of God for blessing as our own blessing and promise, then we can think about we become a great nation through our family, right? We begin with our family. And how have we reflected on this blessing with our family? To ensure that God's blessing becomes our family's DNA, especially shaping the next generation. So some of us who have children, then we can think about how can we maintain this promise as a father of faith as an ancestor of faith. So let me stop sharing once more and then reflect on this question. And I will post this question, chat box too. Briefly sharing my perspective and experience. It's quite difficult to talk about faith as a father, as a husband, and as a Bible scholar or pastor. From time to time, I recognize my home as vulnerable space. I can be genuinely myself, like not thinking about my responsibility as a Bible scholar or pastor. So I tend not to talk about faith and Bible. So this is a huge challenge for me, for myself. Do you guys have any wisdom or failure stories or a practice or family ritual that you transmit or enrich your conversation? Think about that.
I don't know if I have any words of wisdom, but I just want to share how our family started going to church. You know, we came to the US, in the mid 1970s. So my parents came here first, and then my younger brother and my grandma, came afterwards. But when we came to the US, we stayed in the New York City area, and we didn't go to church. We weren't. But it was my grandmother that constantly insisted, on us going to church. And after my grandmother kept on nagging my parents, let's go to church, let's go to church. My parents finally agreed to go to church, but finding a church was difficult because every church that we went to, at that time, the families didn't stay together. The adults had their own service and the kids went to the children's service. But my younger brother, every church that we went to would always cry, and cry out loudly. So it's to the point where my parents would have to go to him. So after trying various churches in the New York City area, there was this one church where my brother did not cry. And that was Astoria United Methodist Church. And so that is the church that was selected. So, from the assistance of my grandma and then my brother picking a church where he didn't cry, that's where, we started going to church. And, to this day, my parents still attend that same church in Astoria. So to them, that's always been their home church and everything. So no other word to wisdom other than that, that's how we started, and we've been going to church ever since.
Yeah, I think as my father and then son, as ancestor or leader of your household, I think it's important to shape the foundation of faith as a family, and then transmit this story, like beginning of your faith, our family's faith, with our family members and to your children. So I think it is important, how can I say, capacity that we can articulate what happened to our family, how God led us into this area, to this church, so that other family members find meaning out of the reason why we are part of this community, why we are here. Yeah. Guang's point gave me some thought-provoking questions. I think the reason that Abraham is not given details, like he didn't ask details about God's plan. I think when we read the same passage, we are asking the same questions, right? And then we don't receive God's answers with detailed reasons, right? like why God is leading us into this trajectory, life trajectory, or why God is leading us into this situation. So based on the fact that Abraham didn't receive detailed information, I think it comforts me, not knowing where God is leading us. And that we can feel this story with our own like testimonies, right? So any thought or observation or testimony that you can share? I have a few other
I can
points.
share.
Sure.
So, personally, so I grew up in the church, but I believe I encountered like God as a personal God in college, and so it was always by people of faith. They like people in praise team or people from afar when they're so in love with God. It was very attractive to me, but it was a big mystery too. Like it's always like, why are they so like? What do they know that I don't know? It was very compelling actually that it brought me to a lot of questions. Like who is the God that they know that I don't? So I was always touched by testimonies because it's like a true account. And one day it kind of dawned upon me, maybe I should just ask my parents, how did they come to believe? And also my grandma at the time. And I was really blown away by their testimony because I think we forget that sometimes as children, we just go to church, right? Because your parents bring you. But then it's really up to us if we want to know their story on because it is very personal how they came to know the Lord. And I think it's because of my two grandmas on my mom's side and my dad's side that our family still holds this, thankfully, this DNA of like kind of knowing the Lord, even though it's like I'm sure many of us we have to come to that realization if you want to choose to or not, but we're exposed to it. And thankfully, my parents never really forced it upon me to go to church or whatnot. But it's like the daily rhythms that they did that always kind of surprised me too. Like they would pray at night, or my grandma, even like those traditional things, like when families come together and like the matriarch prays for the family, like little things like that is it sets a tone that it's kind of important. So yeah, I just think asking your family line, their testimony has been very powerful for me.
Yeah. So now Sarah is considering your family story, like how it began, as such a wonderful blessing from God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think this is important message that we first get by looking at the context of like where this blessing and promise occurs, the beginning of the ancestral history. So we have two new beginnings, and each beginning, like universal beginning, begins with God's blessing, and then particular history, like how people of God begin their journey, like begins with this story also begins with God's blessing. So we just looked at the transition from Genesis 11 through 12. So now the second point I would like to highlight by looking at the context of this blessing is this point. So I told you Genesis 1 through 11 is a primeval history, like beginnings about the world and humanity, so universal history. And then in it, we have a story of Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel, Noah, the flood account, and also the Tower of Babel account. So God's blessing in chapter 12 appears to be a cure or respond to human disobedience. So before we look at Abraham's calling in Genesis 12, it's important to reflect on the broader context of Genesis 1 through 11, where we see human disobedience at its peak. So in earlier chapters, we witness humanity's rebellion, violence, and corruption, as you see in these accounts. So in Genesis 1 through 3, the fall of Adam and Eve through disobedience, we know it. And Cain and Abel from Genesis 4, the first murder spurred by jealousy. And Noah, the flood, God's response to widespread human wickedness, right? And Tower of Babel, humanity's prideful attempt to make something great themselves, right? Themselves great. So it resulted in divine gathering of people. However, despite these acts of disobedience, divine punishment never has the final word. So instead, God's blessing is presented as a response to these failures. So for Adam and Eve, God's covering of Adam and Eve's nakedness after their sin in Eden. And then for Cain, like marking of Cain to protect him from further harm after he killed Abel. And God also established a covenant with Noah after the flood to ensure that the life would continue and never again be destroyed by God's flood, right? So each of these instances, like of human disobedience and also God's responsive blessing, show that God's blessing has been a response to human disobedience. So God's blessing had the final word. So it offered even when judgment, it offered redemption and salvation even when judgment is required. However, we find the final story from Genesis 1 through 11, which is Tower of Babel, doesn't conclude with an immediate blessing to counterbalance the divine judgment. We know what happened after the Tower of Babel account. So people got scattered, people across the earth, and there is no direct sign of restoration. However, this story sets the stage for what happens in Genesis 12. So God calls Abram, and this is God's new strategy to bring blessing. So this is a big chapter conclusion, like Genesis 11 is big chapter conclusion, like primeval history. So it is finished. And now God is going to make a new history with Abram, the family of Abram, and then God is going to bless Abram and then use Abram's family as a blessed response to the previous human disobedience. So this is God's greater plan, probably. And his son mentioned something about making name, like Abram's name great. So the fact that Abram's account is a response, God's response to the previous human disobedience is obvious when we look at Genesis 11, chapter 11, verse 4. So there people share their rationale why they built the Tower of Babel, to make their name great, to make their name for themselves. So the fact that God promises Abram to make his name great is somehow God's response to the human disobedience in Tower of Babel. So one question after all these reading of Genesis 12 in its literary context, I thought about this question. As we reflect on the core nature of God's chosen family, which is part of God's saving or redeeming effort to heal the chasms created by the Tower of Babel. So I would like to think about this question. Have you been in the places where you see division and brokenness? It can be at home, at work, or in a community, or at church. How can you and your family contribute to healing among any conflict situations? Let me stop sharing and then post this question too. Because God blesses Abram to be blessing to others, right? And then we know what happened at the end of Genesis 11. All people got scattered. And we created such chasms and isolation, maybe dispute and conflict. And think about today's world. I mean, even politics. They regard each other as a threat to this nation, right? Like huge chasm. And then small household. I mean, I need to confess that when I'm tired, I have a verbal dispute against my wife, and then we disagree, and then we respond in a very violent way. So, how can we remind ourselves as a blessing to others and as a God's response to Tower of Babel, where people have so many chasms and isms and conflict? Any thought or observation? I throw out big questions, so I know it's my brain is not working well, so I want your answers. I cannot answer these questions. So.
It's not an answer, but I just want to share one thing that I learned from church. So when I was young, I heard from my pastor that when he's visiting church members' house, he got to see different, cultures and dynamics of each families. When he visited one family where they're always fighting, couples are fighting, kids are fighting, there's always fighting. There's a lot of conflict. And also he visited another family. They are very kind people. So he find the big contrast when the same thing happened. So his example was that those family with a conflict, the broken families. So father passed by the kitchen and spilled the water because the cup happened to be at the corner of the table and he hit it. He spilled. The first thing he said was, "Who put the water here?" And then wife says, "Come on, honey, it's always there, your fault, whatever, your fault." They're fighting each other, kids coming out, just fighting each other, blame each other. Versus other family, when he visited, father spilled the water, hit the cup at the corner of the table. And he said, "I'm sorry, it's my fault." And then wife said, "No, no, it's my fault." Because everybody claimed that that's their fault, not cleaning up and not, doing the right things. So I'm not sure if I'm saying the same thing, but when I see the division and brokenness, when they are blaming each other, and the other one, they're trying to take responsibilities.
I think great answer, because based on what we read, I mean, the Tower of Babel account, I mean, the destruction and human scattering occurred because human wanted to make their name great, their own name great, right? And then God called Abram and then blessed Abram to make his name great. So is it for our selfish interest, like our hubris, like my will is important, my opinion is important, or God lifting our name up and then make it greater? I mean, that's, I think, very relevant point what you raised, Lisa. I know Matthew is a specialist in terms of the conflict resolution as a professional. Do you have any lesson that you give, like, I mean, to your family members, like in terms of like
I'll tell them to hire a good lawyer.
I mean, others learn from us. I mean, so if our household become like the visible form of blessing, then I think we can be the blessing for others, right? So I think this is a great question. You have any thought to share, Matthew?
Well, no one in my family listens to me, so I don't share too much. But in my job, when people come to me because they have conflicts with their business partners, with associates, whatever they have, they want to sue and do other things. We try to look for alternative disputes instead of suing, because that creates confrontation. I try to tell them to try. First of all, what is your problem? Then I say, well, it's just the same kind of response that his son gave. I said, well, let's see why they're doing this to you. What is it that you've done, in this partnership that could cause them to do this to you? I try to get to the issue, and I said, at this point, maybe have you tried talking to one another with someone in between? Today, guy came in with his divorce case, and I said, listen, maybe you two guys should work it out. And then I realized, wait, can you two work to talk together? First of all, are you able to talk and communicate with one another, or do you need me to be involved so you can talk to one another without the temperature going up and you start screaming? And sometimes, people can talk things out. A lot of people hold their grudges in, and when they hold their grudges in, they don't express it. And everything the other person says is taken with a negative connotation. When you enjoy something, I'm sure Hizan's laughing, but I'm sure when Hizan is in a good mood with Steve, whatever Steve says and whatever wrong he does, she can smile. But when she's not in a bad mood with Steve and Steve says something, what are you talking about? What do you mean? It can be taken offensively instead of just a comment that's made. So we have to learn to, am I the one that's not appreciating what the other person is saying? Because I could be contributing to the other person. And the concept of religion, we always then conflict to say, well, let's go pray. But, I tell them church people who go to church, I said, listen, have you tried speaking with your pastor before you file this complaint for divorce? Do you have a religious leader that you can go to, or spiritually you can go to first? Because once you go down this path of antagonistic path, it's very difficult to turn around, because you say things that are hurtful. You write things that I will write things that are hurtful that just can't be taken away. Once you spit it out, no matter how much you apologize later, it can't be taken away, because, oh, wow, this is what you thought about me? This is what you actually thought about me? So, and then, it resolves. So I tell them, as in the Bible, in Proverbs, or in song, or no Proverbs, hold the tongue. If you're wise, remain quiet, listen. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your sharing gave me another thought-provoking reflection and insight that I gleaned from this passage. So God calls Abram to be a blessing to other nations, other people, right? And then Matthew just shared, like, if you have someone else who can hear you and who can, like, deliver the message or interpret the message between the two parties, then I think we may have conflict resolution. So maybe becoming a blessing for others, we may be the bridge between the chasms, between the conflicting parties or people, or even like our neighbors, or even at church. I think this is very, very, very relevant and then practical wisdom that we can get. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing it. And I have a final point to focus on. So last time when we read number 6, we also tried to see what's happening before and after, right? So God asks Aaron to say this blessing. And then God finishes that blessing formula with, if you put my name on them, like the children, then I will bless them. So there is a clear instruction. So let's see, like, what is surrounding this blessing, God's promise and blessing. So as Steve pointed out, God says that go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And then Abram, he went. So he was somehow obedience, right? So this is why we recognize Abram as person of faith and the father of faith. So here in this passage, what is the imagery of faith? what is the imagery of life of faith? Is it just staying in one place, or it is continuous unsettling of ourselves? Is it migration, or is it naturalization? I think faith is viewed as a journey of or sojourning, living temporarily and moving forward, moving toward where God leads, right? Without knowing, without knowing. It's like a pilgrimage. So blessing here is a sustaining power for our trip, our pilgrimage, our faith journey. So there's just one call, God's call. You should leave. You should go from your intimate or familiar setting. And then what is the promise? And God repeats God's self, I will, I will, I will, I will, and I will. So we may recognize that if we just leave, then God comes to us. God joins our journey. God becomes our pilgrimage partner, our travel companion. I think this is important perspective. So knowing that faith is to unsettle ourselves, I'd like to reflect on this final question. So Abraham's chosenness required him to leave behind his household and embrace uncertainty. Yet through his obedience, God's blessing flowed not just to his family, but to all the families of the earth. So my question is, have you ever traveled or migrated yourself to follow God's call? How has your journey of faith, despite any losses or challenges, been marked by the presence of God's blessing? So let me stop sharing again, once again, and then post this question chat box. Um, I regard my trip to begin with my answer. I regard my trip to Paramus every week as a big step moving out from my comfort zone, especially writing my sermon is also mental unsettling or mental migration because I think for me it's easy to talk about critical stuff in the Bible and being a critical reader of the Bible, but it's challenging or even more difficult to preach. Like inspiring message. It's quite difficult, and then it takes more time for me to prepare that kind of message. So, however, in this journey, in this migration, I recognize God's presence, like nourishing my spiritual well-being and making me grow. Then getting to know all of you, I mean, who are amazing people of faith. So I'm so encouraged by this migration that I have recently have in my life. Any reflection or observation or memory, or even you think your migration experience coming to this foreign country as sojourning, like moment of faith, transformation, conversion.
I remember in college. So I went to college for a few years in Camden. And so from Camden, I couldn't find a church locally in Camden that I liked. So I went to a church in Elizabeth. So I would commute from Camden to Elizabeth every Saturday, every Sunday, to attend Bible study and different church functions. And people used to say, isn't it hard driving, an hour and a half to get to church every Sunday? And when I look back upon it, those are that time driving to church is some of the most fondest memories I have, because I would, turn on, some worship music, and I would basically have like my own praise session in my car for an hour and a half as I'm driving to church. You know, so other people on the highway must have thought I was crazy because, you know, I'm like crying and I'm like, you know, praising God with my hands up, you know. But those are some of the most intimate times I had with God, traveling for that hour and a half, because for that hour and a half, nobody was going to bother me. Well, maybe the only
Wow,
person who
that's
bothered me
true.
was anybody who cut me off, but you know, I tended to drive a little slower so you know people could just pass me. You know, I stayed on the right side. But that hour and a half just praising God and spending time in God's presence was so amazing. And part of me wishes I could, you know, do it again, but I don't know if I could handle an hour and a half commute anymore.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. It's amazing.
I think for me too, when I have to embrace uncertainty, the thing that always crosses my mind is it's not worth it. I'm always like, this is not worth it. Like, God, this is nuts. Like, I want to take the other way. But I think what Pastor Hyunwoo and Kwang, what you said though, is something that I've been trying to better understand. Is like through that process, the promise of God's presence and understanding His character and intimacy a little bit better. Um, so yeah, I think always though by default, I'm like, this is not worth it, but I'm fighting against it.
Yeah, I mean, based on Genesis 12, what we can learn is leaving our own territory, our own comfort zone, result God's nearness, right? God's coming. And we can think about our departure as God's call, God's chosenness, right? Sarah, you're called by God, and it requires chosen loss, like Abraham left his household, right? And then it's very critical. I mean, we both myself and Huang reflected on our like physical departure, but like in terms of vocation, in terms of mental self aspect, I mean, laying things down and then leaving from where we used to stay. I mean, this is very significant matter. So one quote that I like to share based on this conversation is this. So let me show you. Because, it's better to talk about rather than uh, just read it. So the reason we have to unsettle ourselves is because we can understand our vocation as child of God or family in faith or chosen family like Abraham. We can understand our vocation or our purpose, I mean, of our faith or life journey as a sojourner or migrant who are moving in between places so that we can search, we can find the place where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So I think it's a very inspiring message that we have to think about. So we are called to leave from our comfortness or our resourcefulness and then move our body, move our interest, and think of our vocation as a dialogue where we can travel with God, maybe risking our stability or sustainability of our life, but God is waiting for us to experience God's blessing. And then the moment that we be the vessel for others as a God's blessing. Yeah, that was my reflection too. Any question or observations or thoughts that you can share, even in terms of our previous conversation or other part of today's focus passage?
I think the big issue with the Tower of Babel was that there was a breakdown in communication. And so, at the Tower of Babel, it was basically they couldn't understand each other because they were all speaking different languages. But I think these days, there's a breakdown in communication in that we don't know how to speak with each other in a reasonable fashion, which is why sometimes we need the help of third parties to kind of intercede and kind of help along, in that situation. And I think the story of Abraham, what that does is it's showing that there was this breakdown in communication, and now God is saying, okay, my people are not able to communicate with each other, so I'm going to help them communicate. And he comes down and he chooses Abraham and speaks to Abraham directly and teaches him how to communicate with God. And then through Abraham, we learn how to communicate with God. And then I think this brings restoration to us back into this ability to communicate with one another. That's just my thought.
I think that's a wonderful observation. I learned from you so much, even in this moment, like when we have to think about our identity as God's blessing. I think we be the in-between communicator to make this world communicatable, right? And then less fight, but more love, and peace. I think very fundamental call given to us. And then the one response that we have to do is like to leave, go from our self-interest, self-centered worldview, right?
I have a question. When you said the word sojourner, right? To me, when I hear that word, it sounds very like lonely, right? Is that the proper perspective to think on this life of faith, the sojourner's path?
I think I need some clarification. So did you mention something about Proverbs?
No, like when you use the word sojourner, right? When I hear that word, maybe because I don't have good context of what that means, it sounds like a lonely path. So is that the perspective to think, or is there another way to consider that
I
word?
think that's really interesting question. And then in order to answer your question, I need to share some historical background of this passage. So, I mean, we have to think about different times of the Bible. So story time. So we have time from like biblical chronology from creation to maybe if we think about the first 5 books of the Bible, creation to Canaan. So this is the time that Bible presents, right? Scriptural chronology. And we also have to think about storytelling time, like ancient scribes. They were inspired to write this passage, right? And then ancient priests, they practiced this account. So when we think about storytelling time, this story is read and practiced mostly in the exile when Israelite they lost their land and family, household, and their temple. So what they had is only the Bible, like piece of scroll they can read and practice. And by reading this account, our ancestor left his household, left his homeland, maybe same situation with us. We're very like very desperate situation, not having any agency over our land because we are in the foreign soil, right? Babylonian captivity. So almost you read this passage in exile, then this passage becomes healing and pastoral caregiving account for those who are sojourning, like lonely, like minoritized, and even oppressed. So I think the perspective and then atmosphere and then feeling or emotion that you get, Sarah, by reading this account and then understand Abraham's identity as a sojourner, I think this is somehow God's providence to heal God's nation who will be sojourning.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Even we can understand our identity as Christians, sojourner, right?
Mhm.
We become countercultural, we become lonely, right? But as we do not have our safety or security, sense of security as we sojourn, we know that God is with us. God promised God will be with us, right? Based on this passage. I know, Kwang, you have more
Thank you.
insights.
Well, I just wanted to share this, the last part that you just shared was that, yes, as a Christian, when we walk physically, we may be walking alone, even maybe walking against family, even maybe walking against the community, even walking against our friends, because they don't want to go down the same road that we want to go down. But the good news is that God promises that he will always be with us. Jesus Christ said, I will always be with you till the very end of the age. And he said, I will send you a helper who will help you through all of these things, which is the Holy Spirit. So in theory, we are never truly alone. But when we think about it physically, our friends and family may not be with us, so we may feel alone, if that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you.
And also based on my previous small experience of having teachers worship with Jenny and Sarah, I recognize you as part of ACC. And then we want to be blessing for you as well. I mean, you don't have immediate family members here in our congregation, but I mean, even church is a sojourning community, right? So we want to be your travel companion and travel partner. So please think about that as even our own reflection as a church. Any final thought or question or tearful denunciation or disagreement? And we have Matthew, so who can resolve our conflict? So be bold and then be genuine and transparent. If you have any disagreement with me, you can hire Matthew, even though I will pay with my prayer. If not, can I ask Matthew to give us word of prayer to close today's session?
Dear Father, Lord, we thank you for this time and the opportunity to learn of your word through Pastor Ken. We thank you that during this period that we're able to discuss and learn from one another's insights, our different various backgrounds, Father Lord. Father Lord, we ask that you be with us and not with us only, but with all other members of our church who were not able to join us this session, and hope and trust that they will be able to join us in our next session, not only because it makes this discussion more lively, but they can also be blessed by this event, Father Lord, and they can learn about your word and grow in your word, Father Lord. Father Lord, until we meet again next time, we ask that you be with us and let us always be reminded that you are always with us. All these things we pray in your precious name, Jesus, the Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
good
Thank you,
night.
everyone. You all
Good
have a
night.
great night.
Thank you. Bye bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.